Hello everyone. So I'm going to be talking about these three string quartet studies that I wrote for Apartment House. And these all utilised original score reading technology that I've been developing over the course of my PhD. So I'm sure, as you're all aware, lots of performers are now using score reading applications as a convenient replacement for sheet music, much as e-readers have become a popular substitute for books. But this opens up lots of other potential use cases that come from the fact that score is being read from a digital device. So some of these aspects have already been explored by others. These are three examples of existing score reading technologies that exist in Score, Decibel Score Player, and Max Score. And they all have their own particular use cases and pros and cons. But none of them quite met my own requirements, so I actually sort of moved towards developing my own application. So stepping back from the technology for a moment, as a composer I became really fascinated by what's known as prolation canons. So this is a kind of canon where the same melody appears at different speeds. And there are quite a few examples of this from the early Renaissance by composers such as Johannes Ockeghem and Josquin des Prez. The example that explores this most rigorously is the Missa Prolationum by Ockeghem. So I'm just going to quickly show you an example from the original manuscript of that. And what's really interesting about this piece actually is there's only actually one voice written out for each canon. So this is a 4-part canon, but the parts 1 and 2 are on the left of the screen and parts 3 and 4 are on the right. And if I show you it in slightly sort of clearer notation, the markings which are next to the clef signs are actually mensuration marks, and they show the different tempi that voice should appear at. And then this is how that actually translates into modern notation. So you can see those mensuration markings affect the time signatures that appear, and we have the parts sort of overlapping and intertwining in interesting ways. So if we fast forward to the 20th century, the sort of great exponent of the tempo canon was Conlon Nancarrow in his Music for Player Piano, which explores this idea at a much greater level of complexity. So whereas the tempo relationships in Ockeghem are relatively simple, in Nancarrow's music he started out using, a lot of his works use integer ratios for the tempo relationships, but then he moved towards using irrational ratios and even transcendental numbers. So there's a little example, an excerpt from a Nancarrow piano roll. So you can kind of even visually quite see how that structure emerges. So what's obviously characteristic of this music is that rhythmic complexity actually demands performance by machines. And the vast majority of Nancarrow's music was for the player piano. But in relation to my own research, writing for acoustic instrumentalists, and what is also interesting is that Nancarrow did actually theorise about the possibility of synchronised video conductors. So here's a quote from Nancarrow. He says, "And I've got the idea of each performer having a small television screen with something imitating a conductor that comes to the beat, so they can see it coming, whatever it is. I don't think it would be too complicated. It would probably be expensive, each one having his own screen." So obviously in 2019, the possibility of each performer having their own screen is actually very commonplace. And this becomes a much more real possibility. So moving on to my own music, it's quite different from the examples I've shown, but it does share some of the some sort of common things that underpin it. And the way I'm wishing to use technology is really to make things easier for the performers, to make these kind of complex polytemporal relationships, to make them more direct, and simpler for the performers. And I'm doing that really by using a visual metronome that's embedded in the score. So just before we get on to looking at the app itself, I'll just show you a few little excerpts from the scores of these pieces so you can see kind of the underlying rhythmic ideas. So here's a little example from this study. Now notice I put before in the title at the top. That's because all these complicated numbers and stuff that are in it, I don't see them as being relevant to what I want people to see on the page at the end. They're a sort of essential part of the process in terms of being able to actually get everything spaced proportionally correctly and musically correctly on the page, but really I want the score to look like that at the end. Here's another little example, and in this one you can see the tempo markings in the score I'm actually giving as ratios, and they're ratios to a bass tempo. So that's the way I tend to organise this kind of music. There's an overall bass tempo, and all the tempi within the piece then relate to that bass tempo. But once again, we can simplify that. So in these unbarred pieces, all the notes are proportionally spaced just to make it visually clear as well. And then there's one piece also that uses a static time signature and bar lines, and suddenly the whole aspect of getting that into conventional notation program becomes a bit of a nightmare and a bit comical. But thankfully, there we go, it doesn't look so bad anymore. So in terms of the full score, that's what I'm looking at, but I want to show you now how this translates into the app itself. Okay, so obviously this would normally be appearing on a tablet device like an iPad or something, a separate one for each performer, but I'm just showing you in a web browser for the moment for the case of this. So each performer can navigate this independently. And so they can navigate to a particular piece and a particular part, and then they get onto the part itself. And when it comes to the score itself, there's several ways in which I've kind of taken the performance aspect into consideration. So the player always reads from the top system, and the bottom system is there so that they can look ahead in the music and see what's coming. So as I scroll through this, you'll see that the top system is just replaced by the bottom system through the music. And also, you'll notice that the current event in the score is always highlighted, which actually overcomes one of the main drawbacks of unbarred music as well, because people don't lose track of where they are. So if I just move over to this, so imagine these are 4 separate tablet devices, and I've just put them up on the screen next to each other. So this is kind of more how it would function in a rehearsal situation, and each of these are completely independent, which is quite different actually from some of the other examples of score reading technology I showed earlier, which tend to rely on just sending everything to the device in real time. So I could get up 4 parts of the same piece, for example, for the 4 members of the quartet. But you can see I can scroll through the score independently, and the performers could use this for personal practice in a rehearsal situation or in a performance situation. But then, if they did want to snap everyone to the same position, for example, we're going to rehearse from this particular position in the score, there's a handy snap feature, and that just moves everyone to the same place. And everyone has equal control for starting and stopping the actual score as well. One other little aspect in terms of just that rehearsal aspect, I've also allowed it so that in the rehearsal the actual global bass tempo can be changed if you want to tweak the tempo. Often that's the case when you get into a room with musicians. It doesn't sound quite how you imagine it. You want to be able to move things around a little bit. So you saw it was 54 there. If I, for example, changed that to 62, then you see that changes it in all the scores, and it also changes any other tempo markings that are in the score relative to that. So those are just quite practical things that were done sort of in response to the demands of that situation. So moving on to the visual metronome, which is kind of the crucial aspect of this in how these tempi are related to the performers. This went through quite a variety of versions of varying degrees of complexity. Some of them more directly tried to model the motion of a real conductor and use different kind of models of motion. And I tried out these with performers as well. But in the end, I ended up reverting to quite a simple design in comparison. And this was because I realized a few things. One was that it was most important it was used as something that could be clearly used in peripheral vision, rather than having to be the focus of attention. Another was that it needed to have a really unambiguous start to the beat, and the beat needed to be very clearly discerned. And the other was that because the events are always being highlighted in the score, the two things really work in combination in the way that sense of pulse is conveyed. So I'll just give you an example of this working. Obviously, you're going to see 4 pulses. You would never have to deal with that as a musician. But in this particular piece, the violin 1 and the viola are together, and the violin 2 and the cello are together. And they all start the same pulse, and they start to move out of phase with each other because the parts on the right actually have a sort of controlled rallentando. So I'll just show you this so you can see how that works in practice. Okay, so that just gives you an idea. And it's actually turned out to be quite practical in a performance situation and quite easy to follow once the musicians have got used to it. Okay, I think I'm out of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have a few questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering, is there a view where each performer can see the relationship of their part to the other parts for rehearsal perspectives? Just
yeah, it's not actually. So you can. It's not in this version, unfortunately. But as well as selecting your own part, select the full score.
Yeah.
And then not only will it be sort of so. The event highlighting will work for all the parts simultaneously. Okay. So you can see how the parts relate. But there's only ever going to be one metronome, so you kind of have to select which part that would relate to. But yeah, that does work in that way. Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, it's quite a lot of it's amazing. Quite a lot of visual information for the players to take in. I was wondering if you'd considered hooking it up to a haptic metronome as well to give them an extra bit of feedback.
I haven't actually, but that would be a really interesting idea to try that. Yeah.
Yeah. Now there are devices, and they at the moment they're quite simple, but they can be.
Yeah. Maybe. Yeah, I'd have to talk to you later. I think about exactly how those work because I have to admit I'm not familiar with how you connect them up to this kind of stuff. But yeah, that would definitely be really interesting to try. See how that would work. So, yeah.